Hello, my name is Daniel Karp, and I'm excited to share my research with you entitled Ecological and Cultural Priorities Coincide in Wet Forests for Conserving Neotropical Birds. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge all my co-authors, and in particular, Alejandra Echeverry, who is a postdoc at Stanford, but who completed her PhD at the University of British Columbia and was integral to a lot of this work. So right now, about 15% of Earth's land surface is covered in protected areas. And that's a pretty good number. It reflects a dedication to creating protected areas over the last half century by a bunch of conservation biologists and practitioners around the world. But that number pales in comparison to the amount of Earth's surface that's covered in agriculture, which sits somewhere around 40%, depending on how you measure it. So as we think about this biodiversity crisis that we're currently in, focusing our attention not only on protected areas, but also on these working agricultural landscapes will be critical to stem this tide of biodiversity loss. And there's a couple different ways we could do that. The first thing that we could do is we could try to incentivize the conversion of these intensive monoculture type of production systems towards more diversified systems. So here we have a sugarcane plantation on the left versus a much more diverse system of coffee intercropped with banana, a little pasture up on the left, all in this much more diversified system in Costa Rica. Another option that we could take is we could try to incentivize landowners to conserve natural habitats on their private lands. So here's another landscape in Costa Rica. We can see this integrated network of small patches of tropical forests interspersed within pastures and farm fields in this region. However, we know that these forests on private lands are very different from the ones that exist in protected areas. So for example, in this system, we find that the private forests are about twice as fragmented as the protected areas when you measure just the amount of edge length. We also find that the trees that exist in these privately owned forests are substantially and significantly smaller than the ones in protected areas because there's a lot of logging that's going on in these privately owned forests. And while I don't have any data to back this up, anecdotally, we saw a lot fewer poachers walking around the protected areas than we did in private forests, which were much more accessible and easier for these poachers to get into. So as we think about this spectrum of actions we could take, from diversifying agricultural systems to restoring forest patches on private lands to establishing protected areas, we need to understand how these different actions would affect biodiversity, and in particular, both the species that are most vulnerable and the species that we might want to conserve for various cultural reasons. So today we're going to seek to answer three main questions using a study system of bird communities in Northwest Costa Rica as kind of a model system. First, to what extent can agriculture support high levels of bird communities, high levels of bird diversity? And if it can support high levels of bird diversity, what kinds of species are present in agricultural systems? In particular, are the most ecologically vulnerable, the species of conservation concern, and or the culturally important species able to persist? And if not, would it be feasible to instead incentivize forest conservation on these private lands owned by private landowners to conserve those vulnerable species? So as I said, we're going to be using a model system in Northwest Costa Rica to address these questions, specifically 4 years of point count surveys conducted along a precipitation gradient from the kind of wetter coast of the Nicoya Peninsula, more towards the interior of that's significantly more dry of Guanacaste. We selected 20 different working landscapes in 5 protected areas along this gradient. And in each one of those landscapes, we selected 6 different locations where we would conduct 50-meter point counts of bird communities. These point counts were located both in the agriculture itself, as well as in adjacent small forest patches, and then more towards the interior of privately owned forests, and then also in those protected areas. And then we use binomial mixture modeling to account for unseen species and imperfect detection and estimate the effects of forest cover, configuration, and precipitation on these bird communities. And at the same time, Alejandra Echeverry went out and surveyed both local communities, so local urbanites and farmers, as well as international ecotourists, asking them, 404 different people, about how they felt about each of the different species that we encountered in our ecological surveys. Specifically, she was interested in quantifying the cultural services, the cultural benefits associated with each one of these species in several dimensions. First, how important those species were kind of from a bird watching perspective, how much people enjoyed watching them, their aesthetic value. Second, how beautiful they found their song or how not beautiful they found their song, the acoustic aesthetics. And for this, she would play songs and calls of each one of the birds that was surveyed in the ecological surveys. Third, how important they were for local identities. Fourth, for educational or research purposes, why people might value these individual species. And then their importance to preserve for future generations, their so-called bequest value, how much people would want that particular species to be around for their children or grandchildren to see. And then finally, she asked them about whether the species was disliked for any reasons, perhaps because it eats their crops and provides disservices, or it's ugly, or it has a really awful song, whatever the reason, if they would dislike it. So she created all of these kind of she quantified all of these different cultural services and disservices for each one of the species that we surveyed. And using these data, we could answer our key questions. First, can agriculture support high levels of bird diversity? On the x-axis, we have the percent of forest cover surrounding each one of these point count locations. Each point is a different point count location. And then on the y-axis, we have the number of species. And what you can see in this graph is as you decrease forest cover, you do see a decline in the number of species in the most intensive agricultural sites, but that effect is actually kind of weak. In fact, biodiverse communities could persist in agriculture. But when we look at those communities, we find that they're fundamentally different from the ones that exist in forest. So here's a non-metric multidimensional scaling plot where every point here is a different point count location. It's colored according to the level of forest cover, and the distance between points corresponds to the dissimilarity in the bird communities that exists between those 2 points. And what you can see is this bleeding from the green forest to the kind of yellow orangey agricultural system, indicating a turnover of bird communities. In the forest, we have species like this long-tailed manakin in the upper right, versus in the agricultural systems, we get more species like that great-tailed grackle and rufous-snaped wren in the middle. So agricultural and forest communities are distinct. So what kinds of species are the ones persisting in agriculture? And in particular, are the species that are more ecologically vulnerable able to persist in agricultural systems? We measured that ecological vulnerability by quantifying the range size of all of the different species that we detected in these different point counts, and then averaging the range size of all the individuals found in a given point count. And with that average range size index here on the y-axis, you can see that as forest cover increased, the average range size declined, such that in the really agricultural systems, we get these wide-ranging birds like the great-tailed grackle, versus in the forests, we get species that have more narrow ranges and might be more vulnerable, like the long-tailed manakin here. So narrow-ranged endemic birds are more forest restricted. Okay, what about the species that people value for various reasons? To quantify that, what we would do is for each one of those cultural service values that people scored, we would average all of the species observed in a community, like the range size, and then we would look about how the average cultural service score shifted across our forest cover gradient. And we found that as you increase the amount of forest cover here on the x-axis, you get more and more species that people enjoy watching, like our long-tailed manakin here. So an increase in this cultural service. And when you look at other cultural services like acoustic aesthetics, identity values, educational values, and bequest values, you see the same trend of increasing cultural services with the local forest cover. However, the only exception is with the disservices. You see species that people don't like as much in agricultural systems relative to forests. So to sum up, the species that people value most are most often found in forests, whereas disliked species frequent agriculture. So what we're seeing here is that diverse communities can exist in these agricultural systems, but they're not composed of the species of conservation concern, and they're not composed of the species that people like. So what about restoring forests in these working lands? Would that safeguard these vulnerable species? And to get at that question, we developed yet another index. And this one measures the similarity of any given location here, point count location. Here, again, each one of those is a dot. How similar that site is in its bird community to the nearest protected area. And unsurprisingly, as you increase the forest cover, you increase the similarity to the nearest reserve. However, what's remarkable is if you look at the actual reserve sites and compare them to other reserve sites, you see that the sites that are really forested on private lands are about the same level of reserve similarity to other sites as reserves are. That tells us that the bird communities in privately owned forests are basically indistinguishable from those present in reserves. What's also nice is that we can then use these models and couple them with a little bit more information about the landscape context and the regional kind of precipitation to predict how the similarity to reserves would change across our region if we were to engage in restoration of agricultural sites. So we did this for the Ohansha Nandayure Biological Corridor, an area that's being actively managed for restoration right now. And we found that in areas that are wetter near the coast and in areas that have more surrounding forest cover, restoration would result in the greatest increase in the similarity of that bird community to a reserve community, such that targeting restoration or reforestation to these wetter, more forested sites would really benefit reserve-affiliated birds. So to sum up, what did we learn today? First, diverse bird communities really can thrive in agriculture, but the species that live in forests and farms are different, with the vulnerable species and the culturally important species really preferring forests. However, restoring forests and working landscapes, especially in the wetter and more forested regions, would help recreate these reserve-like bird communities and in particular safeguard the vulnerable bird species. So with that, I would like to thank my co-authors, private landowners and survey participants, the National Geographic Society and other funders, and all of you guys for listening. Thank you, and I'll look forward to your questions in the chats below.